do that. So there we go. So now we are in chapter 9, called Skills for an Intuitive Life. And I just want to start off by saying, I think this might be my personal favorite chapter of the entire book. I love this chapter. I really, really, really love this chapter because it's talking about intuition, but it's taking it and applying it towards really your own paying attention, starting to pay attention to your own intuition, like really tuning into it at a whole different level. So I'm going to start off with, on my book, we're starting off with on page 204, the paragraph that starts off with the lessons I take. From The Mysterious Image in the Garden. He's talking about a story that he told about walking through this garden. And he says, to realize how important it is to deal with life's mysteriousness using your imagination and intuition, prepared for paradoxes and surprises, able to appreciate how intricate the path toward fulfillment can be. It isn't enough to be reasonable, to follow the crowd, to do what is expected, and to be normal and adjusted. We have to be like the figure in the garden, old and young, feeble and bird-like, infantile and wise. And then in the following paragraph, he goes on to say, I don't use the word intuition lightly. I don't mean a simple hunch. I'm referring to a deep kind of knowing that doesn't follow the rules of logic and can't be found through research and reasoning. So I love that. I love that. I love at the top of page 205, where he talks about intuitions can go quickly. You have to watch for them. You need something like a dream catcher, a feathery net to grasp them when they appear. They are like subtle messages coming at you, but so delicate and thin that you might easily let them go by. Because they are not the product of reasoning and factual research, you have to learn to sort them and eventually trust them. I will tell you that in my own experience, what will happen is, especially if I'm receiving an intuitive hit on something, that if I don't grab it somehow, which normally for me involves writing it down, I'll lose it. So I'll be in the middle of doing something and it could be anything. I might be out going for a run. I might be spending time in prayer or meditation in the morning. I might be having a conversation with a friend and all of a sudden something will say, basically what it sounds like to me is, pay attention, Mike, this is important. So this thought will come in and it happens for me all the time. And I need to capture it. I need to write it down. And I don't know what it means necessarily or where it's going to plug in, but I just know it's really, really important for me to be paying attention. Like, for example, I'm in the process of putting together, one of the things I want to do this fall is I'm really thinking about doing a spirit group on applied metaphysics and using affirmations and denials. Like, that is a really strong intuitive hit that I've been having lately. And as a result of it, they're starting to show up. So in other words, I'm flipping through a book the other day, and all of a sudden I'm reading something and I'm like, oh my God, this would be perfect for that class. And now it's like, okay, write that down, Mike. We're going to come back to that. And so it is a capturing. And so when he's talking about this, I just can so totally relate to it because that's how it works for me when I'm getting intuitive hits. But I've got to be listening, and then I have to capture it, because if I'm not listening, obviously I'm not going to receive it. The other thing is if I don't capture it, then it's wasted. And I tragically have had huge intuitive hits and have been in the middle of doing something and have gotten busy and go, oh, I need to remember that. And then later in the day or 2 days later, I'll go, oh my God, what was that thing that came through? And I'll have completely forgotten. And I lost it, and it's not that it won't eventually come back, and it's not like spirit is punishing me. I don't believe in any of that, but I do believe that these are flashes, exactly what he's talking about. You've got to be able to capture them for some way. In the following paragraph, he talks about this idea, you got to grab them before they disappear. elevate them rather quickly, and then trust the ones I decide to keep. And I think that's another very valid point. Just because I'm getting all these downloads doesn't mean every single one of them I necessarily going to follow up on. So I just think that's part of the process, is learning that you can have intuitive hits, that you can get information, and some of them might be, I'll do something with them, but not every single one of them. So it's kind of funny because I don't do this as much anymore, but I used to have little sticky notes. I literally would have 30 or 40 of them all over the place. Yeah. And until you all of a sudden realize, look, I can't keep track of all this stuff. And some of the stuff is not really relevant in terms of right at this moment. And so then you learn how to, you use discernment, which is another really important tool to be using. So on page, I'm gonna, in the section into intuition and timing, on page 207, I love this. The paragraph that says, parenthetically, let me say clearly the gist of this book. The discovery or creation of a religion of your own is not an option. I love it. I absolutely love it. You don't have a choice. You're gonna create a religion of your own, whether you do it consciously or unconsciously. That's really what he's saying there. And so, in my opinion, I would much rather do things consciously than unconsciously. And I really love the entire premise of this book because, again, in my opinion, why don't you step back for a minute, pull everything out of your little religion box and see if it still fits. And if it does, then put it back in the box. But if maybe there's other things that you can add to your box that might feel better for you now at this point in time of your life. Because why? Because we evolve, we change. We're different people than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago. And so to me, it's about spiritual maturity. It's about growing. It's about changing. It's about all of that. He goes on to, and I love this. I'm just going to read quite a bit here because I just love this. Resist it and hide either in a religious institution or in a fully secular world, and your soul will be stuck. You'll have symptoms and you will not be happy. You may spend years wondering what is wrong with you, why you're sad or sick, why your marriage isn't working out, or why you can't find work that you can love. You may wonder, what is this all about? So just so you know, often I will have conversations with clients of mine, life coaching clients, who checked all the boxes. They did everything that they said they were supposed to do in order to be happy. And guess what? They're not. They're actually miserable. Why is that? Because they're not following their soul. They're not listening to these intuitions, these intuitive hunches. And so that's what happens is you get, wait a minute, I checked all the boxes. Everybody said I'd be happy if I did. If I went out and got a career and I had a family and I got the nice house and I got all the bells, the whistles, and the toys, I'm miserable. Why is that? That's why. That's why, because they're disconnected from their soul. And then he goes on to say, I now believe that it would have been irreligious of me to stay in the church instead of following through on my intuition. That's what it was, that fate had a different life in store for me. So previous to this, he tells the story of him getting ready to be ordained as a Catholic priest. Literally the week before he goes in there, he goes and he has a talk with the senior pastor, priest, whatever you want to call it. And he said, so, we're still good with this. And he said, well, I'm not 100% sure. And then the elder said, well, then you can't do this. You can't. Why don't you take another year off? And he just looked at him and said, I'm not taking a year off. I'm done. Now, how crazy is that to go through all of that, especially at that age, and say, no, this isn't right for me. I've got to follow my intuition. I've got to follow my intuition. So he goes on to say, I didn't know what the future would bring. Like stepping off a cliff, I was going into a free fall. I had no assurance that I would find a more meaningful existence, and I didn't have any clues as to what the future could be. I was at the mercy of pure intuition asking me to surrender. I love that line. When you're at the mercy of pure intuition asking you to surrender. One of the people, the guy that I work with says everything that you want is in the unknown. Everything that you want is in the unknown. And it resonates just like with this stuff where it says pure intuition is asking you to surrender. So it's just saying, trust me, trust me. I'm guiding you, I'm directing you, but you've got to trust me. In other words, you need to let go. You need to let go of what you think is safe and, right? Intuitions can be challenging. They're difficult to grasp, keep, trust, and understand, yet they are essential, especially in spiritual matters. And I would say, highlight that one, yet they are essential, especially in spiritual matters, because this is where you're starting to learn to listen to your own soul. This is when all of a sudden you're being guided towards a particular teaching, a particular practice, spiritual practice, a particular way. And all of a sudden you don't know why, but something's tapping on your shoulder saying, hey, pay attention. Pay attention. And it's like, why? I can share with you recently, I'm really being drawn into some work, some healing work called internal family systems. I've shared that with you a little bit, but this is really, really becoming strong with me, and something that I think can be a beautiful part or piece of a healing practice that I can bring in to the community as another opportunity for people that are looking to do a little bit deeper work emotionally to heal. Not everybody needs it. Not everybody's going to resonate with it. But for me, it is a absolutely beautiful practice, completely falls in line with every single spiritual practice and discipline, especially in unity. It just goes deeper on an emotional level. And for me personally, I think that is desperately needed for a lot of people. They just don't know it. So I'm really being drawn into that work, and I'm following it. The next paragraph, he goes on to say, an essential phase in the spiritual life is to discover your destiny, your calling, or God's will for you, whatever way you want to put it. This important issue requires a constant and deep intuitive reading of events. The ultimate question is, who am I and what am I called to do in this short life? Again, I think that is absolutely beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. As I skip forward onto page 209, at the top of it, the first prerequisite for a religion of one's own is the ability to be connected to the mysteries without having to explain them. The reason I love that so much is I can boldly stand up in front of everybody and comfortably tell you that I don't have all the answers, but I know who does. You have all the answers. And so I can comfortably say that. In fact, I don't want to know all the answers. I don't. I want life to be somewhat of a mystery. I do. And so I'm comfortable with that. I used to want to know all the answers. Now I don't want to know all the answers. I'm very comfortable with saying I don't know. And I'm also okay with not knowing. And I figure if I need to know, then God will let me know. That's how I look at this. That's how I look at it. In the paragraph after that, he just makes a comment. He says, from the outside, it looked to everyone like a perfect life, but it was her failure. So this is the story, and I might have jumped a little bit, of the woman who looked like she had everything, but she was miserable. In that whole paragraph, because she was this, things began. Oh, and it talks about this idea of when you finally do make that step into this process that you go through. You think it would be, oh, it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great. In some cases, though, for some people, it might look like your life's falling apart. And he goes on to give that example, because you finally have let go of the rigidity of, well, it's got to look like this. And your soul is calling you in a different direction. And for some people, when they start letting go of the boxes, all of a sudden their life looks like it's falling apart, when the truth is it's not falling apart. It's actually probably for the first time really coming together. But there's an adjustment phase. And that's, I think, really, when I read this, I think about this adjustment phase that people can go through when they go through this process. the paragraph down below, most people understand a spiritual path to be one that leads upwards and beyond. But Jung was aware that it may bring us back into a deeper and creative chaos, a state of origins and beginnings that allows new life to form, a process of transformation that is a quote unquote long and wearisome opus, unquote. Not a brief and exciting rebirth. Some people don't have the stomach for it and they give up. Even some spiritual movements embrace a positive philosophy exclusively, neglecting the role of integration in the making of a soul. And I put next to that unity. I think there are some people in unity that do that they don't actually pay attention to the emotional side of things. Some people don't need to. My belief is most do. My belief is that most do. A religion of one's own is a process, not a static state with a forward and backward movement. I love that. You've heard me say up front many, many times, my own spiritual journey, it was like I stuck my toe in the water and then I had to pull it out. And then I stuck a little bit more in and then I pull it out. And it's just going in and the coming out, the going in and the coming out, the going deeper and then needing to take a break and a breather for a minute and then going even further. And that's what my own personal journey has been like. And so I totally resonated with that. I'm going to skip quite a bit further. Guides and markers, it just talks about, he's just talking about really the way that he was basically guided into his path. And then he tells the story about Thomas Merton on how he received this message on page 211, where he was told, go to mass, go to mass. And for Merton, who's one of his mentors, or one of Thomas More's mentors is Merton. Merton actually was living a life and then was guided to go into a ministry. And basically that's what happened with his life. And so he received a message. And then he goes on to talk about the story, which I found a little bit fascinating, the story of how Charlie Sheen had an experience. Thomas More had an experience with Charlie Sheen, who was a really strong and devout Catholic, and how Charlie Sheen was using that and meeting together with young men in guiding them, if you will, into their own Catholic faith. So it was an interesting story. It talks about synchronicities. To me, I put next to synchronicities, God winks. I know we've talked about God winks before, but it's the idea that things happen in your life when you're really tuned in, that there's no way on God's green earth that it could have happened without it being orchestrated, or something happened in such a way that it's undeniable that you're being guided, you're being directed, something is happening in such a way that there's no way you can't even be explained. On page 213, he talks about, at the very bottom, you can cultivate synchronicities by paying close attention to the times and the places of certain meaningful events. You don't need causal connections, just coincidence and timing. How many people have been thinking about somebody and all of a sudden their phone rings and it's the other person on the other end of the line? We all have, right? It's happened. Or just stuff like that, where it's undeniable. How? Then you tell yourself, well, how could that happen? Well, the reason it can happen is because when you're connected, the universe is kind of letting you know what's going on. On page 214, he says, I take synchronicities as signs and guideposts. Reading them regularly and giving them some attention makes your world come alive. I love that. I love that. He then goes on to discuss different ways that you can receive information, which I can totally relate to. So he talks about the I Ching. He talks about tarot cards. He talks about tea leaves. I love cards. I love playing with them for inspiration and guidance. I probably got 10 sets of cards. I don't have just one set of cards. I got all different kinds of cards I use. And I'll wake up occasionally and pull a card or pull a series of cards. Sometimes when I'm with a client, I feel like inspired to go pull some cards for the client. And the more I can trust that, the more, in some cases, it's absolutely mind blowing what'll come forward if I'm pulling them for myself or I'm pulling them for a client. I actually pulled them, Susan will remember this, at the retreat that we had for when we as the board got together. I actually pulled them for the church. It was mind blowing how the cards can pick up on a collective. They can, if you'll ask, they will pick up on it. And the stuff that we were given during that time with those cards was just stunning. It was absolutely stunning, because what I did was I went around and I did it for each individual first, and then I did it collectively as a church and a body. And it was fascinating to me. Absolutely incredible. So there's different ways that we can get these intuitive hunches, if you will, or use our intuition. And one of them is actually using physical things where you're really asking spirit to come through and give you a message by another means. Again, the I Ching, tarot cards, tea leaves, and there's other ways of doing it. We're not restricted in the way that spirit will come through and talk to us. And speaking of which is really fascinating, he talks about using a mirror, which I found just fascinating. I've never heard this one before, but for him, looking into a mirror, and then he mentions a story of somebody back in the day that used to use a mirror, and it was in some museum, and he found it fascinating. And then his son or daughter bought him a mirror, and then he started using the mirror to get intuitive hits. And he says, he goes on to talk about that, and it's called a scrying, S-C-R-Y-I-N-G, a scrying mirror. And he saw it in the British Museum. And he talks about this person named John Dee, who used to use it all the time. So he goes, so then he's fascinated by it. And then, like I said, the story is his son or daughter bought him one, and he started using it. And eventually he became to the point where he used it almost all the time. In fact, on 216, he says in the paragraph, nowadays, just before I'm scheduled for an hour's consultation, I might take a quick look in the mirror. I gaze only for a few seconds, but in that time, I usually see a couple of things. And he goes on to describe what it is that he sees. So he's using it for his own intuition and using it. I thought it was brilliant. And then in the paragraph below that, he talks about the mirror has taught me to perceive intuitions immediately. I no longer need any intermediary of thought and reasoning. I can also sense when the timing is right for such a method. It isn't always the case. And I think just that look at, everything doesn't work all the time. So, sometimes I'll pull cards and the cards are like, oh my God, they're like spot on and amazing, incredible, beautiful. And other times I'll pull a card and I'm like, meh, yeah. You ever read a daily word and have a daily word like go, oh my God, like they wrote this for me today. And then you pick up the daily word and you're like, right? So it's just amazing how that happens, right? And it doesn't mean that there's any right or there's any wrong or there's anything like that. All right. And then he talks about prophecy. So I'm going to pause the recording. All right, so now we're going to move on to chapter 10, which is natural magic. And on page 221, he goes on to define magic. He says, magic is a way of acting that is effective and powerful, but doesn't use the usual cause and effect, rational methods of science and common sense. It's magic, right? And he talks about all the different ways that this can happen. And he starts getting into some descriptions about using even words. So it's interesting. He talks about, for Americans on page 222, for American, the words, we the people. In the Catholic Church, he goes on to say, this is my body. In Heart Sutra, chanted, written, and memorized around the word empty. So he just talks about how words can sometimes be magical. On page 223, he talks about and under the archetype of the sky. I'm not going to talk about the sky because I'm still into this whole words thing. But I mean, if you think about it, as I was reading the whole thing about this idea of using words, I thought, well, in unity, where do words become magical? And then I thought, of course, about affirmations and denials. Right?
Right.
Yeah. At the bottom of page 222, I'm going to back up for just a half a second. In the paragraph that starts off with some religions judge magic, there's a sentence that says, the same is true for a religion of your own. Appreciating the magic in life helps you live outside the perimeters of reason. In that way, magic serves religion.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really great quote. You know, he goes on to talk about different things like the magic in the sky. He starts to talk about astrology. And again, I'm just kind of skating over some of this. On page 226, he starts talking about the idea of space, and not only in terms of in the sky, but then he starts talking about climbing a mountain to experience this contact point between the earth and the sky is really beautiful. He starts at the bottom of 227, he starts talking about some principles of magic. And he goes on to say, we are headed for a new style of thinking and living, and some old and rejected perspectives may well return with new dignity. On page 229, he starts talking about different tools of magic. Once again, he starts talking about different things. For example, tarot cards he mentions. He starts talking about colors, how colors can be magical. And I know for artists, that can be the case. I would throw in here music can be magical. It was interesting because I went in and I just scribbled, and it's funny because Sharon mentioned this, but I wrote down the word muscle testing in terms of being magical. At the bottom of page 230, he talks about a bunch of different things: fountains, atria, megalithic sculptures, hanging fabrics, dramatic lighting, flowers, and plants. They can all transform a space magically. And I don't know about you, but I like having a lot of that stuff around me. And like I said, I've got an altar that's got a bunch at home that I've got a bunch of stuff on that just brings me back into this state or presence with the potential of magic. He talks about food on page 231. The magic that food is another example of an ordinary substance that has magical properties. Certainly the Catholic Church believe that because you've got the wine, you've got the, when you take communion, the bread. And then he goes on to say, in the paragraph on 231, from manna in the desert to Jesus saying over dinner, this is my body. So later in the paragraph, he goes on to say that gathering over food can have a religious quality and purpose. Eating is not just for the body, but also for the soul and spirit. And I don't know, but to me, there's something very fundamental about getting together and breaking bread together as a family, as a church, as a community. And that's why I really love how we do after the service, people sit down and share a little meal. I think that's really, really cool. On 231, he starts talking about magic and religion. In the first paragraph, about halfway down, he says, for a religion of your own, magic can be a way of stepping outside materialistic ways of thinking. It can place you in a liminal space that is shared by religion, where things can happen without the force of will and literal manipulation. To me, I call that letting go and letting God. We just back out of it. We let go. Our hands are off the steering wheel, God. You are in charge. in the following paragraph that starts off with magic stands next to mystery, there's a sentence that starts off and says, you can become a master of the invisible and the mysterious, not just to show off, but to be effective in making life rich and meaningful. And I totally, wholeheartedly believe that. I almost say the same thing every single week towards the end of the service. One of the things he talks about, which I absolutely love, is, and I didn't know there was a word for it, but now I do. And the word is called bibliomancy. I didn't even know that was a word, didn't even know what it means. But what that means is, have you ever had the experience of picking up a book, opening up a page, and voila, there it is. This amazing thing comes forth. So my wife, I got a great story about this. My wife just recently went on her vision quest. You've heard my story about my vision quest, but she went on a vision quest and she did it on the property where we live, but she didn't come anywhere near our place at all. She was back in the woods where she couldn't see anything. She wasn't talking to anybody or anything else like that. But what happened was, after 2.5 days, she really needed to come to the house and grab something, and absolutely positively had it, but she was really struggling, like a lot in at this moment in time. And she came into the house, grabbed what she needed to grab, and as she was walking out, there happened to be a book sitting there, and basically was like, she just had an intuitive hit to pick up this book. She opened up the book and she turned it to this page that had this poem. And I'm not kidding you, when if you were to hear it, the poem, when she told me the story, it was literally like God herself came down and said, here's the message that you need for this moment in time. It was stunningly beautiful and so spot on. It was amazing. It was just absolutely amazing and beautiful. And so I have that happen to me often. We all actually do. Like I said, the best example is the Daily Word. When you pick that up and go, oh my God, that's amazing. So I think that's really fun. On page 233, to establish a religion of one's own, you might consider not doing everything logically and in a fully controlled manner. You might look up for signs and coincidences. You could follow up on synchronicities. You could do some simple magic, placing your finger blindly on a map, opening a book to a page and a line, swinging a pendulum pendant, picking a card from a deck. These two are all very simple forms of everyday magic that leads you to non-rationally towards your objectives. I use pendulums, I use muscle testing, I do all of those kinds of things. And sometimes it's breathtaking. Yeah. And then on page towards the end of the chapter, the last little piece is I'll mention, he just talks about this idea in the second paragraph. Then you graduate to more refined methods. And I just made a note and I said, find out the way that Spirit is trying to speak with you. Because in my opinion, Spirit is always trying to speak to us. And when all of a sudden you grasp that and you think that, then it's a matter of, well, how can Spirit speak to me? In other words, what are the opportunities that I'm creating space in my life for Spirit to be able to speak to me through? Could it be prayer? Could it be meditation? Could it be muscle testing? Could it be cards? Could it be whatever? There's a lot of different ways that it can be done. And I think what this does is just make you ask yourself the question, where am I creating space in my life to allow Spirit to speak through me? Am I creating space in my life to let Spirit speak through me? Am I doing that? And again, we don't do shame, blame, guilt, or judgment here. So we're not judging anybody or anything for doing it or not doing it. But I think when you really start looking at this process, then all of a sudden you're like, well, why would I not want to create space in my life so that I can listen to spirit. Oh, another thing I just thought of, I happen to think of, what's another way that you can speak? How about journaling? Journaling is a huge way that spirit speaks through me. And so there's all these different ways that you can do it. I just last Sunday, for those of you that tuned in, or those of you that were there, I did what? Metaphysical Bible interpretation. That was powerful. That was amazing. And that's another way that spirit can speak through you. So there's just a million different ways that you can do it. And I think that it's a great way for him to start including this idea of opening ourselves up to different ways that spirit can start to speak through us. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording.